Connais-tu l'histoire que me racontait ma nounou? C'est une belle histoire que j'écoutais sur ses genoux. Si le cœur t'en dit, ma jolie, écoute-moi, je vais te la dire à mi-voix. Elle était une fille douce et tendre comme toi, tout aussi gentille, se promenait dans les bois. Et voilà soudain qu'en chemin, elle aperçoit le grand méchant loup aux abois.
Hello everyone, welcome to the UFPA Philosophy Lectures. I'm Emiliano Boccardi, and it is a great pleasure to introduce you to my good friend and colleague Marco Ruffino. Professor Ruffino is a well-known Frege scholar, and his expertise areas range from the philosophy of logic, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of language. Today, he's going to give us a talk about the contingent a priori. Let us welcome Marco Ruffino. Hello, Marco. How are you?
Hi, Emiliano. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for the invitation, and congratulations on your idea to, record these talks and broadcast. It's a nice way to, to do something interesting during these crazy times that we're living.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It doesn't look like you're in a lockdown very much there.
I am actually at a friend's house out of town, right? Very, very much isolated from the city with my family. It's a beautiful place, very sunny, so we are happy here. So it could be that my kids are going to cross screaming here at some point because they're playing like crazy here.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, tell us everything about the meter stick and the contingent a priori.
Yeah, the meter stick is one of the classic, one of the two classic examples given by Saul Kripke in his well-known essay Naming a Necessity, published in 1980, but actually this is the result of some talks that he gave much earlier. For a long time, it fascinated me, the idea presented by Kripke, that just as a result of a stipulation, right? There is a possibility of knowing some truths that are actually contingent, but because they were stipulated, right, we can know them a priori. And how exactly that happens is a delicate matter. But in Kripke's reflection in Naming a Necessity, that comes out from some properties that proper names have. Right, proper names are, according to Kripke, that's an idea that he tries to develop and argues for in Naming a Necessity. Proper names are rigid in the sense that they refer to the same individual in every possible world, in the sense that when you build a counterfactual reasoning, you are always talking about the same individual. You're always talking about the same person, right? If I talk about Aristotle, and just imagine that I'm imagining that Aristotle could have been, done something else, but not philosophy. Aristotle could have been a soccer player instead of a great philosopher, and so on. I'm still talking about the same person, right? So a proper name like Aristotle holds on rigidly to its referent in these counterfactual reasonings, or in, as opposed to most definite descriptions or other sorts of designators, they do not hold on rigidly to the referent, right? If I say the author of the metaphysics, in different counterfactual situations, I'm talking about different people, right? Not just about, not exactly about Aristotle. Well, but as Kripke mentions in Naming a Necessity, sometimes some definite description or some collection of the definite description is used to fix the reference of a name, right? For example, then he gives a classic example. For example, the rigid term meter had its reference fixed by reference to a meter, to a particular bar, metal bar made of platinum. So the meter was by stipulated to be the length of that particular bar at a certain time, right? That was in the 18th century at some point. So as Kripke says, just as a result of that stipulation, right, at least the baptizer was able to know something entirely a priori, namely that that bar is 1 meter long, but that this represents a contingent truth and not a necessary truth, right? Because the bar could be longer, could be smaller, could be could even perhaps not have existed. This is a very interesting example, right? It's a fascinating thing to imagine that you can know something a priori, and nevertheless, that proposition describing that fact is a contingent proposition, right? There are different sorts of reactions in the literature. The second, let me mention briefly the second example. The second example is the example of Neptune, right? Exploring the historical episode of Le Verrier, coming to the conclusion that there is a planet with such and such properties. There is a planet that is responsible for the perturbation in Uranus orbit, and he called that planet Neptune. So he sends a letter to the Berlin Academy of Science, and some days later, they could find Neptune exactly in the position in the sky predicted by Le Verrier. So, according to Kripke, there was a proposition that Le Verrier knew entirely a priori, namely that Neptune is the cause of the perturbations of in Uranus orbits, right? And nevertheless, this proposition is, of course, a contingent proposition, right? Or the proposition that corresponds to this sentence is a contingent proposition. And Le Verrier, because of the stipulation, because he was the baptizer, because he named that planet using that definite description, he was able to know, he was in a position to know entirely a priori, and that means without making the proper astronomic observation, without that need for that particular experience, to know that Neptune is the planet responsible for such and such perturbations. So these are the two classic examples that Kripke gives, and from naming a necessity on, there was a great discussion concerning the plausibility of these examples, right? We find people like Michael Dummett saying, well, look, if Kripke comes to the conclusion that because of the properties of rigidity of proper names, if he comes to the conclusion that there are some truths that are contingent and nevertheless can be known a priori, that means that there's something deeply wrong with the whole idea of rigidity, right? Because why? Because it's absurd to imagine that we can know a priori something that is contingent. A similar reaction came from Donnellan, right? My professor Donnellan at UCLA. He says, well, look, we cannot stipulate that something is a contingency. Contingencies are things that you cannot just stipulate. Contingencies just happen. If maybe only God can stipulate that a certain sentence represents a contingent truth, right? Contingency, if something is contingent, that means that in order to know that proposition, you have to do some empirical investigation, right? So there must be something wrong with the very core of Frege's idea. That's Donnellan's reaction in a famous paper from 1977. And other people, there is also a famous paper by Horowitz, Tamara Horowitz from 1983, where she says, well, no, look, there are some things that we have to know in advance in order to be certain that Le Verrier's stipulation or the meter baptizer stipulation was successful, or that it worked. And for example, we have to know that Le Verrier was entitled to introduce the name of a new planet or a new name in astronomy, and that's not trivial. So, and this is basically empirical information. So that destroys the whole thing, destroys the whole prospect that there could be any a priori knowledge in those cases, right? So there are different sorts of reaction in the literature. It's an interesting discussion, right? You have people like Nathan Salmon, Plantinga, Scott Soames. They all are very skeptical about Kripke's idea. idea of the very possibility of a priori knowledge of contingent truths. But I think there's a perspective about Kripke's examples, a perspective about his ideas that made them sound very natural, right? Not as I'm gonna say, there are different. The examples are not homogeneous, right? You have the meter example on one side and the Neptune example on the other side, but there are deep differences between them, right? That's also something that we can see if we adopt this perspective. And the perspective is taking taking a clue from Austin's discussion about what he calls performative verbs, right? First of all, what he called performative verbs and performative utterances. Let me open here a parenthesis. I'm going to start talking about something that seems to be totally different from what Kripke was saying, and then I'm going to connect them at the end. So Austin discovered in his famous lectures, How to Do Things with Words, that there are some utterances, right, that if uttered in the appropriate way, right, if some conditions are satisfied, then the speaker is actually doing the action that is being represented, or the action named by the verb, right? So I hereby baptize you, so I'm baptizing, or I declare blah, 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 I'm declaring, right? So I nominate Emiliano my legal representative, I'm nominating you, right? These are, that's crazy, I know. So these are special utterances that Austin calls performatives, to distinguish them from other utterances that he calls what do you call constative utterances, right? Are utterances that are meant to describe facts in the world. Like, for example, I play soccer. It's not by saying that I play soccer, I'm not playing soccer. I fry an egg. By just saying that, I'm not frying an egg, as opposed to I promise that I'll pay you tomorrow. Just by saying I promise, I am promising. So on one side, you have utterances that are performatives, right? Just by saying it in the appropriate way, you are doing the corresponding action. On the other side, you have the what Austin calls initially constative utterances, in which by just saying them, you're not doing the corresponding action. You are trying to describe something present in the world, which is independent from your utterance, right? I am sitting in front of my computer. That's not performative, because by just saying that does not mean that I'm sitting in front of my computer, although I'm describing the world correctly in the second one. So towards the end of Austin's work, he comes to the conclusion that this distinction is actually a little bit artificial, because in any utterance, some sort of performative action is being done. I can be either asserting something, or I'm asking something, right? And sometimes I want to make that explicit, so I insert a performative verb. But even if I don't insert a performative verb, I'm doing some sort of performance. I'm performing some sort of action, which a special action, right? I'm performing a special kind of act, which Austin called an illocutionary act, right? I'm asking, or I'm ordering, or I'm proposing, suggesting, advising, and so on. And the performative verbs are actually a way of making explicit what is the illocutionary act that I'm trying to do, right? What I'm trying to perform. So that's Austin's idea, and this idea was developed, was taken up by his student John Searle, and put in a very formal and nice and way and easy to understand in a treatise published by Searle and van der Wecken, Daniel van der Wecken, in 1985, called Foundations of Illocutionary Logic, right? So the project which I am trying to work, the project that I'm working on right now, the idea that I'm trying to develop is an application of Searle and van der Wacken's idea of illocutionary logic, right, to Kripke's examples. Why is that? Because if you look at the Kripke's examples or the Kripke's sentences, let's say, right, 1 meter is the length of the meter stick. 1 meter is the length of that particular stick. Let's call it stick S at T0. Or Neptune is the planet responsible for the perturbations of the planetary orbits in Uranus. If you look at those sentences, originally, they cannot be true initially. Or some people could say, if you are introducing a new piece of terminology, a new name in a language, they cannot be even false. They are neither true nor false originally, unless they are made true by the baptizer or by Leverrier, right, by a special illocutionary act that must include somehow a performative. If there is no performative, explicit or implicit, in Kripke's examples, then they cannot work, right? If before the baptism, somebody places a stick in front of the somebody places a stick in front of you and asks, is that stick, is the stick 1 meter long or not? There's no answer to that, right? There's no answer to that because, well, the sentence, the purpose of the sentence is not to describe a pre-existing fact, right? So that sentence must first be made true, right, by an act of baptism, an act of a stipulation, right? So it must somehow contain either, we can say it contains implicitly a performative verb, or it has some sort of special illocutionary force, which is not a description originally. It cannot be a description, right? The same with Leverrier's sentence, right? It cannot be originally a description. It must be a special illocutionary act. It's not just Leverrier is not doing an assertion, and the meter baptizer is not doing an assertion originally. He's doing, he or she is doing some other sort of illocutionary act, right? Something that contains a performative verb. And performative utterances, so I'm not saying that Kripke says that. Probably he's going to disagree. He wants to build his ideas, he wants to develop his ideas solely only in terms of properties of reference fixing and so on, right? But the examples don't make any sense if they are not treated as special cases of special illocutionary acts, something corresponding to the force of some performative verb, like I baptize, or I stipulate, or I name, I fix, something like that. These are all performative verbs. I stipulate, I baptize, I fix, I nominate, I declare, right? Something like that has to occur, right? So people have been looking, both, I don't know, I think both Kripke and people that criticize Kripke, they have been looking at his examples, I think, from a wrong perspective, because they are not paying attention to the fact that these stipulations, right, when they are made, they require a special illocutionary act, right? The illocutionary act corresponding to performatives, right? So we must look what is going on in the semantics of performative in order to understand what the chances are that these things are true and that there can be no a priori, right? That's the idea. So applying so to say, the machinery of illocutionary act theory to Kripke's ideas, right? And I think the result is quite promising and interesting. Why is that? Well, first, let's look at the way Searle and van der Wacken think of performatives, right? For them, performatives are particular cases, right? Special cases of what they call declarative speech acts, right? So they divide, Searle and van der Wacken consider that there are basically 5 big types, 5 categories of speech acts. There are what they call assertive speech acts, of which assertion is perhaps the paradigmatic case, right? When you assert or try to describe it the way the world is. So Kripke's examples, they cannot be assertion, an assertive speech act. Why? Because they are not the description of the way the world is. They are creating something new. They are bringing about something new, right? Especially the meter case. It's bringing about a new fact. Which kind of fact? It's not just an empirical fact. It's as I'm going to say later, as I see it, it creates a new institution that's basic to science, to the practice of measuring, to the practice, industry and so on. It cannot be a description. It cannot be a declaration. It cannot be an assertive speech act, right? The second big category is the category of a commissive speech act, right? Is when you, for example, promising something, right? Is commissive speech act in their terminology is meant to engage the speaker in a future course of action, right? So promises or acceptances of invitation are the most prototypical cases of commissive speech act. The third big category is directive speech acts, right? Is an attempt to get the hearer or the audience to do something. Is a sort of a kind of order, right? Do this or do that. I think hardly Kripke's example fall, the examples or the illocutionary force behind his examples fall under the commissive or directive speech acts. I don't know. I think it's weird to locate them there. There is the fourth category is what Sir Van de Velde could call expressive speech acts. Like when I greet, "Hey, hello, Emiliano," that's greeting. That's an expressive speech act. Or when I express my pain, or when I express my joy, or something like that. Obviously the speech act behind Kripke's example is not of that kind. But there's a fifth big category, right? That's where they locate the performatives. That's what they call the declarative speech act. A declarative speech act is a very special kind of speech act because it makes its propositional content true by means of the very declaration, right? This sort of speech act usually requires an institution backing the speaker, right? The speaker has to have some sort of special authority, right, in order to be able to transform a certain propositional content into something true, right? For example, I must be a judge, I must be a judge so that at the end of a trial, when I say the defendant is guilty, I am transforming that propositional content into something true by means of my utterance, by means of my declaration, right? If I'm not a judge, I can say that, but I'm not thereby creating a fact, right? Or another example, if I am a priest, if I'm a priest, or I can say at the end of a wedding ceremony, a Catholic wedding ceremony, I can say, I hereby declare you married, right? So from that point on, something new is created, which is the status of that couple for the Catholic Church, right? But I must be a priest, there must be a special, there must be some conditions, but if those conditions are satisfied, right, by just saying that, the priest is creating something new, is transforming a certain propositional content into a new fact, right? Which is the new fact is the matrimonial status of the couple, right? The same with the judge. So I think that something like that is going on in Kripke's example. Both examples, right? Of the contingent a priori truths, right? By saying 1 meter is the length of bar S at T0, right? That in order to become something true, that requires a special illocutionary act, which is a declarative illocutionary act, right? And that might require a special kind of authority on the baptizer part, right? If I'm the one authorized to do that, I can transform that into a new truth. But if if I'm not an authority in measurement or so on, right, I can create my own measurement system for some crazy reasons, right? But nobody's going to take that seriously, right? It could be, so to say, a truth within my idiolect, right? But it's not a truth that other people are going to take seriously. We have an interesting example, something more realistic. We just had recently, 2 years ago, a new definition of the kilogram, right? There was a conference, the General Conference of Weights and Measures. A lot of people, specialists, they got together. I think it was in Geneva. I think it was in Switzerland. It was 2 years ago. And at the end of the conference, they declared what is the new definition of kilo, right? They could do that. They did that, and they changed our life in a way, right? They changed the life of basically everyone in the planet doing science, and everyone in the planet using precision instruments, right, for industrial purposes and so on, right? How could they do that? Well, first of all, right, they had to satisfy some preparatory conditions. They had to be the authorized authority. They had to have the authority to do that, right? The new definition is given in terms of a certain amount of Planck's constant, right? Planck is a constant coming from quantum mechanics relating the energy of a photon with its frequency and so on. So they decided that 1 kilogram, that's the new definition, 1 kilogram is identical to a certain amount of Planck's constant, right? Is this a natural fact? Is this something coming from nature? Of course not, right? This is a matter of decision. And in order to make this definition true, they need to be backed by a certain authority, which they had, right? If it was just a matter of a natural fact, what would be necessary at the end of the meeting would not be a voting, but they had to take a vote at the end of the meeting, right? Do we all agree to call 1 kilo this certain amount of Planck's constant? And people had to say, I vote, I do, I agree, which is a bunch of performative utterances, creating a big performative utterance or a big declaration, which is the new definition of the kilogram, which has to be accepted by everyone, right? Because everyone recognizes the authority of that of the General Conference of Weights and Measures. So, but that's not an assertion, an assertive speech act. That's a declarative speech act, right? A declarative speech act which makes a propositional content true by means of the very utterance. So at the end of the conference, someone must announce the official result, which then transforms that propositional content into something true. And this is a very interesting example and much closer to our reality now. It's not just somehow a crazy example coming from considerations of rigidity of names or an abstract example and so on. That's something very close to us, and it certainly changed our lives, right? So the idea then is that Kripke's insight that some truths can be known a priori and nevertheless are contingent truths, that's very plausible if we consider the sentences introducing or the utterances introducing these new truths as declarative speech acts in Searle and van der Wecken's sense, right? Of course, you can ask the following. Looking at these speech acts from Searle and van der Wecken, for Searle, every speech act is composed of it has two abstract parts, right? It has the propositional content, and on this propositional content, you have an illocutionary force acting on that, right? So I can have one propositional content with distinct illocutionary forces. I can take the same content and ask you something, or can order you to do that, or I can propose to do that, I can suggest to do that, or I can assert that, right? I can do distinct things with the same propositional content. And I can take a certain propositional content and make it the subject of a declarative speech act, if I have the proper authority and so on. And by doing that, I transform that propositional content into something true, right? That's the idea, the general idea that Searle and Van der Wecken have. So now, what is then the propositional content in Kripke's cases, right? In the case of a meter and in the case of Neptune. Emiliano, arrivederci.